There are 8 billion humans on Earth. The Space Force Association is bringing over 2,000 of them together, all with the common goal of preserving and protecting our thriving space domain. The most critical space power challenges will be addressed. This is your invitation to be part of the solution. Attend the Space Power Conference and help secure our nation's legacy in the stars.
Hello, welcome to another edition of the Space Association Space Warfighter Talks. I'm Greg Gillinger, and today I'm very excited to talk to Dr. John Plumb, the current and first Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy. Dr. Plumb was confirmed in March of 2022, and he is responsible for the overall supervision of policy for the Department of Defense for space warfighting. His policy portfolio encompasses the department's strategic capabilities for integrated deterrence, space, nuclear weapons, cyber, missile defense, electromagnetic warfare, and countering weapons of mass destruction. He also serves as the principal cyber advisor to the Secretary of Defense. Dr. Plumb has served in various national security roles, both in and out of uniform, for nearly 3 decades. He started out in the Navy as an active duty submarine officer, where he served on fast attack Los Angeles class submarines and as an instructor at the Navy's nuclear power school. He then transitioned to the Navy Reserves, commanding 8 different reserve units for over 20 years, and just recently retired. As a civilian, Dr. Plumb has held roles in the Senate, Pentagon, and on the National Security Council staff at the White House. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Physics from the University of Notre Dame, and a master's degree in physics and a PhD in aerospace engineering from the University of Colorado. Dr. Plumb, it's great to see you again. Thank you for spending some time with us.
Well, thanks, Greg. It's great to see you too, and it's kind of fun to do this. So I really appreciate you reaching out.
Yes, no worries. Hey, can you tell our Space Force Association members a little bit about your current position and the scope of your responsibilities?
Sure. Let me just start by saying, one, thanks to the Space Force Association for the support to the Guardians and their families. I think that's it's great. I'm glad to be part of this conversation. And I think everyone listening on this knows and realizes, but space is absolutely essential to the U.S. way of war. And our Guardians, frankly, are on the front lines of ensuring that hopefully we won't have to fight, but if we do, we can prevail. And so part of my job is ensuring really that the entire executive branch and congressional branch, as it comes to national security, is aware of the value of space for national security and the critical missions that it provides to the joint force in order to make sure we continue to have support and continue to move forward. It's just interesting. My position, even though I didn't get confirmed until last, March of 22, my position was created at the same time as the Space Force. Just like the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, the Space Acquisition Executive, Frank Calvelli, his position was created at the same time. So these 3 things were created at the same time. And that was on purpose. And so I think Congress, in their, I'm going to say wisdom, actually realized we really needed someone to be in charge of the acquisition piece for space. We needed someone to be in charge of policy for the government for space, at least for national security space, in order for the Space Force to be successful and for the country to really course correct on where we're headed for how we use space for warfighting. And I really think it's actually struck a really good balance. I work very closely with General Saltzman. I work very closely with Assistant Secretary Calvelli. And so the 3 of us, frankly, I also work very closely with Jim Dickinson, Commander of Space Command. But these roles are all kind of these upper level stakeholder roles for space. And we need to work together really to move the ball forward. So let me just tell you a little bit about what policy does in general. Right. So we have our military services, but inside the Office of the Secretary of Defense, OSD, there are several components. One is policy. One is research and engineering. One is acquisitions and sustainment. One is INS, which is intelligence security. But policy those of us in policy like to think, but we have a somewhat unique role in which on one level we serve as the National Security Council to the Secretary of Defense, right? So the president has his National Security Council. Well, we're sort of the National Security advisory body, National Security Council of the Secretary of Defense. Second, we have basically the writ to be the primary representatives for the department to the White House and to the Congress. And so we are out kind of an outward facing piece within the government, and policy itself has a pretty important role, right? I mean, acquisition is one part, policy is direction from the secretary to the department. So we're constantly writing or rewriting policies to get the secretary to put his imprimatur on or to shape the way he wants the department to run. And as we do that, we need to make sure we're not, make sure we've got buy-in from the White House, make sure we've got buy-in from Congress, make sure if people need convincing as we go ahead, how do we bring all these things together? So you can imagine it's this constant churn of information and conversation based by facts and based by the threat to understand where we need to go. So it's busy. It's really fun. And I think what I have come to understand also, and this is really important. So I'm confirmed by the U.S. Senate as a member of the administration. That's what all assistant secretaries are generally. And the value of that is the administration needs its own space policy lead. And I think this had been missing for many years. And I think this is one of the reasons we're having a lot of success is this role is an administration role to make sure that communication between the White House and the department and within the department is all being kept within, I guess I would say, kept within those baskets of, the direction the administration wants to head. It's part of my charge is to make sure we're following it. So it's a really good handshake. And I did not understand coming into this role how important it was to have a person who's been confirmed by the Senate on the administration team to be writing the space policy, but I am absolutely convinced now that Congress really nailed it. So that's a long talk, but I hope that helped a little bit.
No, thanks for the great background and introduction. And being the first at anything is challenging. What is it in your background that you think prepared you for your role, for your current role?
So I mean, frankly, part of it was working with you at the White House, right? Being on the National Security Council staff for me was super useful for understanding how the overall government works. It's a viewpoint and approach that you don't get in any other way that I can think of. Like you can't see it at the executive branch, but maybe at the secretary level, but right. There's just a very different view of how the whole interagency works and what those pieces are. But, everybody's path to Washington, D.C. is serendipitous. Everybody's got their own version of it. But mine really was fundamentally, I didn't know anything about working in D.C. I'd been a submarine officer. I went to grad school for aerospace. I wanted to go do space. And my advisor told me to apply for a fellowship to the United States Congress to be a scientist and engineer for the U.S. Congress. And I looked at all the forms. I was like, how old was I? Maybe 30. I looked at all these forms. I was looking through. I'm like, I don't feel like this is the person they're really looking for. So I didn't do it. And I can still remember this. 1 week later, she came down into my office and she's like, where is your application? And I said, oh, I'm not doing that. She said, I don't think you understand. You work for me. You're filling this out. And I went on my desk on Monday. I was like, oh, I did not understand. But because she pushed on me for that, Christine Larson at the University of Colorado, she pushed on me for that. I did win that fellowship. And then I moved to DC and started working in the U.S. Senate. And that basically changed my career because from the Senate, I got to go to the Pentagon when President Obama won the election the first time. Senator Salazar, who I was working for, became Secretary of the Interior. I'm a national security guy. I'm not going to Secretary of the Interior. I mean, I love the Secretary of the Interior, but that's not really my thing. So I got a job at the Pentagon, from the Pentagon to the NSC, as you know, and then it just puts you in that ecosystem. And as opposed to any other part of the world I might have been working in, you kind of get used to the DC piece. And so when this ASD for space came open, I think I was well situated to be that person. Again, all serendipitous, but also pretty interesting.
And a little bit of forced mentorship, it sounds like, from your
yeah. Well, never underestimate what one concerned mentor can do to change a person's career.
Very valid. So as your day-to-day role in the Pentagon. Can you kind of describe to our listeners and viewers, what does a typical day look like for an assistant secretary of defense working in the Pentagon? I assume you have your own parking spot, so that's one issue you don't have to worry about.
I do have my own parking spot, so that actually probably saves 15 minutes a day right there. I don't know if there's a typical day. I think there's kind of always, probably most of our jobs, but right, there's this balance between those things you're trying to work on to really drive the ball forward and kind of move forward, looking toward the future. Then there's all those things you're reacting to because of the urgency of now, and trying to make sure that you can shape that. I mean, roughly at the Pentagon, time is measured by meetings, right? So meeting. Sometimes we forget that it actually can take quite a while to walk from one part of the Pentagon to the other. So we really have more than 0 seconds to get between meetings. And so we spend a lot of time making sure that the meetings I'm going to add value, and that I am prepared for them, so we're not wasting my time or other people's times, and trying to make sure that those pieces, both that we have to respond immediately to, and those ones that we're trying to shape and just require tremendous yeoman's work. We really have to throw your shoulders into things in the Pentagon. Otherwise, you just get distracted by all of the day-to-day, and you'll never get that chance to move the ball forward. And I'd like to think that for our space team, we've really given them the freedom to kind of really get that space to push on these bigger problem sets, because that's where your real success is. Reacting day to day is required, but the satisfaction is, can I really move the ball forward?
Now, what would you say is your time horizon in terms of issues that you're concerned with? Are you looking at the here and now generally, or more in the 3 to 5 years out time frame?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. On time horizon, the building is really focused on China as a pacing threat, and we have been using 2027 as kind of our timeline. How prepared can you be by 2027 to deter a conflict over Taiwan, under the assumption that perhaps China is thinking about trying to be ready for an invasion of Taiwan by 2027? Again, conflict's not inevitable, but it's good to have a benchmark. Now, in the world of budget processes, 2027 is almost here, right? We've already, we're starting to build the 26 budget. And of course, even if it got passed, things that you start building in the 26 budget aren't here in 3 months. And so that 2027, even though it seems far, is actually basically right now. But so what can we do by then? I do think the longer term piece, both on space, I have nuclear weapons as well. This issue in the 2030 to 2040 timeframe is a thing that I think is easier to start thinking about, because you can see forces moving, but things aren't, and you can see how the national security environment is shaping. But if you want to be able to respond to it in any meaningful way, you need some time to prepare as the security environment, might continue to degrade. And so I think those are the two pieces. Near term, and then 35 is probably a pretty good angle, and it's fun when you get time to think farther out, but that's a little bit more scarce.
Thank you for that breakdown. You mentioned that you coordinate often with General Saltzman, the Chief of Space Operations, and he's written and spoken at length about competitive endurance and its tenets. What's the relationship between you and your office and U.S. Space Force leadership?
It's very tight. I have tremendous respect for General Saltzman, and we communicate, certainly weekly, sometimes multiple times a week, but really trying to foster a very open and trust-based relationship, because frankly, we both need each other to make sure that the country's doing the right things on space for national security. And so the more in step we are, and the more we can do what I will call supporting fires for the other, the better both of us do. And so I think that's really, really an important part of this job. And standing up your own Space Force, he's got his work cut out for him too, right? I guess he's following General Raymond, but it's still very young. He's still trying to build a culture for the Space Force. So however we can help with that is also really important.
Thank you. Now, space used to be a sanctuary for operations. It's no longer that way, right? It is a contested and congested domain. However, space does seem to still be a sanctuary for both political parties. So it seems to be one of the few issues that remain in our country today where you receive support from both political parties. kind of what's your take on that? Why is it that case? Is it that case? And what's that look like moving forward?
So it's a good observation, and I do feel a bit privileged. I do feel like that's where we are right now, which is nice. I think if we somehow make space political, that will be an error that could have long-term ramifications, right? If you think about just the idea of building satellites, building rockets, launching things into space, and let's be clear, I do national security, but people also start thinking about astronauts. This is all very exciting stuff. It's a very exciting time for the country for space, based really on this kind of sudden surge over the last few years of all sorts of companies being involved. You can watch launches all the time. And when I was a kid, you had to wait a long time to see another launch, right? So it's very exciting. It's got people interested. It has kids interested. And I think that all helps. I also think the realization at the upper branches of government, upper levels of government, both executive and congressional, that space is so essential for national security, at least when it comes to DoD, that also gives it more of a feeling of make sure we're doing the right thing and let's move together. I also work personally, and I'm not the only one, really hard to make sure being as transparent with Congress as we can be and show them where the problems are and what we're doing and have a real two-way conversation, which I'd like to think is at least partly based on having worked over there myself. Like, you need to have that two-way conversation to also build trust there. And I think it just helps in general help us move forward. And I think it buys a lot of goodwill, which gives you some of that as well. So it's it would be great if we can keep it like this. I think it's much better for the department and for the country if we can keep this kind of a bipartisan support where we can wrangle at the edges, but people all agree we need to be moving forward.
Fantastic. Thank you. How did the national security strategy and the national defense strategy shape the Department of Defense's space planning, budgeting, and operations?
Yeah, so national security strategy issued by the White House, national defense strategy issued by the Department of Defense. I will say, and basically the national defense strategy's goal is to comport to the national security strategy. It does. And so in the department, we basically spend all of our time making sure that we are mapping to the national defense strategy. And our 2022 is a national defense strategy, has 4 priorities laid out: defend the homeland, deter strategic attack, deter aggression, build a resilient joint force. All 4 of those require investments in space. And so as far as how these things affect space planning, budgeting, operations, as we build a budget, which is a massive process for anyone that isn't aware, right? Basically, it's a year-long process of getting the services to get together and then trying to figure out how the money should flow and then try to figure out the upper-level priorities. In the end, everything needs to map. Really, for instance, the national defense strategy, you have to be able to map back. Here's how this supports this. Here's how this supports this. And frankly, if it gets down to more of a knife fight for resources at the end, right? Things that do support versus don't support have a higher likelihood of surviving. On space itself, one of the things we talk about is the need for resilience. And by resilience, most people just think proliferated constellations, and that is one version of resilience. But what resilience really means is that no single attack is going to destroy your ability to use space to support the joint force. And if you're resilient enough, then you can devalue an adversary attacking your space architecture because, for example, if you think about a direct descent ASAT taking out 1 satellite or 10 taking out 10 satellites, if you have 100 satellites and the degradation of 10 satellite loss is a small percentage, the value of that is pretty small, right? And so that, in theory, can help deter such an attack. Resilience is not just your space-based part of the architecture. It includes your ground, it includes your link, but all of those parts, talk about building a resilient joint force, that's one of the things. Resilient joint force requires access to space when you fight, and that means that the architecture needs to be resilient. So we do put a lot into that bucket as we build these budgets to make sure that we have that. It's not the only thing, but it's really important. I'll pause there if you want to have any.
No, I think that's a great response, and it leads us into a discussion perhaps of what's driving our national defense strategy. And that is, you mentioned before, Secretary Austin views China, and President Biden views China as the pacing threat. Right. And I was hoping, can you describe from your vantage point how you see China's space evolution, both on the counter space side and then also on the use of space for their own joint forces, right? For their own operations.
Exactly.
They try to extend their range and capabilities to.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think it's really important to recognize, Greg, that there are two sides to that coin, right? So we talk about space as a contested environment. When you talk about the need for space to do war fighting, one version is we need, as the United States, to be able to protect our satellites and our space architecture from adversary threats, right? That's kind of protect and defend. But we also need to protect and defend our men and women in harm's way from the adversary's use of satellites. And you could have the most resilient constellation in the world that there is no value in attacking any of it in some idealized version, impossible to reach, no doubt. But none of that defends, for instance, an aircraft carrier from being seen by a Chinese satellite and then using that to target missiles. And so there's two sides to this equation, and we have to be aware of both. You asked me about China as a pacing threat. I am every day struck by how valuable it was for Secretary Austin to come in and say China's a pacing threat. Right? I mean, when we were working together in NSC, I mean, when I've been bomb administration, I was raised in the Cold War. I mean, we basically focus on Russia, China sort of tracking them. When you flip that equation and you say, look at China and where are we, it has changed the way the Pentagon does business because they are advanced and they are also moving at scale and at a speed that one might not expect. And when I say speed, I mean the speed of their development of their space architecture in the last 10 years is remarkable. And the thing is, they're building their space architecture to keep us out of the fight. They don't have legacy systems from 50 years ago and legacy acquisition systems. They started building this thing as for a warfighting purpose, and they're building it for us. And so recognizing that this really is our pacing challenge, and this is the thing we need to get after, has really helped, I think, in many ways, put folks on the same page, all pushing the rope uphill together as opposed to fighting each other inside the building. And that has been truly a rewarding time to work in the Pentagon on that.
Yeah, it strikes me 10, 15 years ago when I first started looking into these sorts of things, China was pretty much considered rest of the world, right? And now they're...
Yeah, no more.
No
more.
Certainly not the case. And as you're going about your day-to-day, is there a counterpart for you in China? I mean, what is China's doctrine and strategy in terms of space capabilities that you can share with us?
Yeah, one, I don't know if I can share any of that with you. But here's what I'll say. They fully recognize that we rely on space for our warfighting mission. And they've also recognized that they need space for their warfighting mission. So that is clear. If I have a counterpart, I'm unaware of it. I think it's really good news from the recent APEC summit that the president and Xi have agreed to kind of further open up communication channels. We just had one of our first talks at the DASD level, so level below me, with some China representatives, I think on November 6th or 7th. That was all in the press, but that's the first one in a long time. And so we need to be talking. It is always better to be talking than not talking. And frankly, it's a sign of what responsible powers do is you have to talk to each other. I mean, the goal should be to avoid conflict. So you need to talk to each other to start to understand. If I can just pivot for a second, I would just say one thing from the national defense strategy I failed to mention, and one thing that really becomes increasingly important on China as in other places, is this issue of allies and partners. The national defense strategy and the White House have really pushed on us to expand the use of allies and partners for integrated deterrence. And on space, really, it's kind of exciting because the field's wide open. This hasn't really been done before. So one of the things we're working on in my offices is how can we do combined space operations, by which I mean space operations with allies. And different allies are slowly starting to develop their own architecture. Some are more capable, some less. You can see a future where many, many more countries have access to and have national security interests in space. And so working together on that helps, I believe it helps raise that deterrence threshold to prevent conflict. And space is a unique domain where it's not actually geographic, and actions in one part of an orbit can affect folks on the other side of the earth in 30, 45 minutes, right? That is actually a pretty important and somewhat unique function of space. And so working on that is also makes this job very interesting and exciting.
Thank you for that. And clearly China is growing its space capabilities at an impressive and some would say alarming rate. And I think you hit on some of our primary strategies for maintaining our advantages, or at least maintaining our pace of space development. Are there any other strategies that you're pursuing, or what are some of the hurdles that you're encountering in terms of working with more of our allies and partners?
Great framing. So working with allies and partners is one part of this. Absolutely essential, I think, and clearly the way of the future. Another is working to figure out how to bring kind of commercial innovation into the department's acquisition strategies faster. Now, I'm not an acquisition authority, but I can help set policy on the need to use commercial space companies to help bolster our own warfighting capability. And one of the biggest hurdles to all of that is information sharing. Whether it's working with allies and partners, whether it's working with commercial industry, frankly, whether it's talking in the building to other people that work on space or talking to the intelligence community that works on space, we have created really an onerous set of information sharing barriers that are no longer useful, in my opinion, for the speed that we need to have information and data flow in the 21st century for warfare. And so we are putting all of our shoulders in my office to rewriting a 20-year-old space classification policy, which is outdated. I mean, it was definitely fine at the time, but this is no longer appropriate, and we have to get to the real world. But as I'm learning, even as you identify a policy and realize, hey, the more I can change this, the more information I'll eventually be able to share with other people or be able to have level set communications. It feels like a little bit of an onion. There's always another policy you have to go uncover and fix. And it's almost not an accident. A lot of these legacy policies for information sharing are based on sharing intelligence, not at the speed of warfare, but sharing intelligence based on due diligence and trying to protect things that frankly are probably observable now. Mm-hmm. But you have, decades of this legacy set of policies, and shifting those and changing those is a big effort. And what we've learned, I think, in the last 2 years is if you want to make big changes on space, you got to bring the whole department along. And that's what we're doing, but that just takes some time. So, that's probably my number one priority right now is getting that fixed.
On behalf of a grateful nation, thank you for taking that.
I'll let you know when things are appropriate, but thank you.
Another legacy that it's not just for the space domain, but I think and I know acquisition isn't your primary role. There are others that fill that role, but it does have policy implications in that for a number of our domains, maybe all of them, we acquire systems per weapon system, right? And it's not really an emphasis on integration or perhaps cross-queuing between different weapon systems. Where it's, from what I can see on the unclass side, China is launching basically constellations of spacecraft that will work together to provide better outcomes for China. Are you seeing investments from Department of Defense that will also encourage kind of that innovative approach, kind of that constellation-based approach, not just putting up an imagery satellite, but imagery satellite that can work with us with a different type of satellite to become more efficient and effective?
So I guess my short answer would be yes. Department realizes we need to move faster, realize we need to have, get away from exquisite solutions in geo perhaps and move to more proliferated architecture. But then it's not just enough to say a proliferated architecture. What are you doing in that architecture? How fast can you change it? How fast can you do tech refresh? and where can you grab good solutions from so you can move a little bit faster. General Saltzman recently said government fast, not, maybe not business fast, but that's important. The government needs additional requirements, like the thing needs to work in crisis and conflict. It can't just work in peacetime. But I do think we have a recognition we need to do this. I will say you've probably heard about JADC2, Joint All-Domain C2. I mean, this general idea of being able to move data quickly around the globe from warfighters to weapon systems to decision makers is really important, right? And that is going to absolutely be anchored on space. And so there's a lot of pieces moving there. This Space Development Agency is new. In the way of the world is how the department does space acquisition, and all support to Derek and his team, really trying to get out there, make a difference, and prove that the department can move a lot faster than it has in the past and move in tranches, with the idea that, okay, well, I'm going to get best technology I can now, and then in a couple of years I'll have an upgraded version and we'll send that out, but we don't have to wait to meet my exquisite requirements 20 years from now. What can I get up now? And in 3 years, what can I get up, for example? So I think we are moving towards there. And I also think that's exactly the thing we need to be doing.
A final question. I noted that as a result of the recent meetings with President Biden and Chinese Premier Xi Jinping, that one of the initiatives moving forward is the resumption of military to military exchanges. And my thought is that space would be a very fertile ground for those discussions. I was wondering your thoughts on discussions with China regarding space moving forward.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks, Greg. I would say a couple things. One, as I said at the top, absolutely important to talk. Talking is always better than not talking. I think it's a great outcome from the meeting with our president that we will resume mill-to-mill talks. I think it's really important to make sure we have our militaries talking to each other, which is one of the harder pieces often. I will say I do know that there is interest in both countries on talking about space. On November 6th, when we had I think we called them the strategic dialogues, but don't quote me on that. But here in DC, I actually had a member of my space policy team at those talks to deliver some points on space. And I think that's a really important piece where both countries would benefit from further communication, really just literally on preserving the stability and safety of the domain, which is in both of our interests to be able to operate in.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Plumb, for your time today. That's kind of the end of my questions here, but I didn't know if there's any other areas you'd like to address before we conclude.
There is one thing. Well, actually, I guess let me raise just two quick things so everybody's tracking. One, I talked about the classification strategies that we're trying to rewrite, these classification policies. There's a lot of reasons for that. A lot of reasons are, deep bureaucratic reasons. Some reasons are sharing with allies and partners. But there's also just a really good Space Force reason for that. I'm not going to say it's the driver of it, but if we could get a lot of our very classified things down to a top secret or secret level, then the ability of more and more of the Space Force, the Guardians, to understand really the whole environment and the whole responsibility that they're part of, I think that will be very useful, both for building a Space Force culture and also for more retention and pride in the mission. I mean, people know you do classified things, but the more you can know as a member of a service, just like the submarine force that I was in, right? We do some super classified things, but at least the whole submarine service knew what we sort of were all doing. And that is really important for that culture. And so I'm really hopeful that will happen over time. The other thing is on commercial space, we are writing a commercial space strategy. The secretary and the deputy have both asked me to write, and that is hard work. But it's really important to get this right. There's just a lot of innovation going on in industry right now that is not the defense industrial base, and having an understanding of how the department can have better access to those solutions and an approach to doing so, I think is going to pay huge dividends. So those are the two things. Other than that, I would just say this has been great. I really appreciate it. I love your background. Are you in space? I didn't ask. But if you are broadcasting from the space station, this is even cooler. But mostly it's just been wonderful to spend some time chatting with you, and I really appreciate this.
Oh, no, thanks, John. And no, I'm not. In my head, 80% of the day, I'm generally in space, as you know. But no, and thank you for your time and best wishes to you. And hopefully we'll see you at the Space Power Conference here in Florida at the middle of the month of December. But thanks a lot, Dr. Plumb. Really appreciate it. It's great seeing you. Best wishes to you and the family.
Thanks, Greg. You too. And anytime. Take care.
All right.